So hi, everybody. It's awesome to be here in Berlin with all of you on this lovely Sunday afternoon. It's really crazy to me to have seen all these amazing talks today from people from so many different places. It's a really awesome reminder that the community around GraphQL that we've all built together is way bigger than Silicon Valley, where I work. It's truly worldwide. So my name is Byron, and I work on our product infrastructure team at Facebook, where we build the tools to help our teams build great products. I'm also one of the co-creators of GraphQL, and today I'm the primary editor of the GraphQL Specification, which I'll be talking a little bit about today. And also, I want to apologize for anyone who's expecting me to wear a bow tie today. I usually wear bow ties during my talks. Today I have a little bit of a sore throat, so I'm just doing my best to project, make sure my voice is heard. Didn't want to tie it down, so gotta let it loose today, let it loose. All right, but before we get into spec, I want to take a moment to reflect on where we are today, where we've come from, and we'll start with a brief history of the GraphQL project, although I know Dan already went pretty deep into it earlier today. So this year we got to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the original prototype and the first early versions of GraphQL that we use at Facebook. So back in 2012, along with my coworkers Dan Schaefer and Nick Schrock, we built GraphQL in response to a very real problem that we faced that existing technologies at the time just didn't quite solve. Use of Facebook on mobile devices was exploding, and for the first time, we saw a huge portion of the Facebook community arriving over some pretty terrible networks and some seriously underpowered low-end devices. Also, at the time, our mobile apps were responsible for a considerable amount of data management that they had to do, loading and merging data from all these different sources, munging that data into useful pieces for use within our apps. And then that meant that updating our apps with the latest features or experiments was laborious, cumbersome, and error-prone. So in order to produce great experiences with our apps, while also managing an accelerating release schedule of new features, and today we release our apps every week, we had to build a lot of new things, and GraphQL was one of them. So since then, GraphQL has not just become a critical part of how we build apps at Facebook, but thanks to releasing a technical preview almost 2 years ago, in July 2015, it's also helped bring this community of people together and become a tool in your belt as well. And it's pretty crazy how many people are here, and I know this is only a small sliver of the community that we've built. So why did we release this as a technical preview? We'd originally done this because at Facebook, we had put GraphQL through the biggest change since its original creation. A total redesign of the language, incorporating everything that we had learned so far. Kind of like how Brooks was talking about how they wanted to make all these changes right before they relaunched to the public. We were kind of finding ourselves in a similar position. We knew that as soon as people were using GraphQL outside of Facebook, we wouldn't be able to take anything back. So we had no idea what it would look like to use GraphQL within any other company or behind any other app. But so much has happened since then, and it's kind of hard to believe that this was less than 2 years ago. So what followed was a veritable explosion of activity from all of you, which has honestly been kind of a challenge to keep up with. I learn new things at these conferences just like the rest of you. Many companies, especially startups, began to dip their toes in the water with GraphQL, and a handful of bigger companies put their vocal support behind it, especially GitHub. At this time, the spec went through kind of a hardening phase, where we were responding to feedback and clearing up ambiguities, and the result of that was an official release, no longer a technical preview, in September of last year. And that brings us to today, May 2017. Today, we've heard about all kinds of new tools for GraphQL. We've heard some pretty interesting experimental ways to use GraphQL. And most importantly, we've heard stories and lessons learned from integrating GraphQL into real products at real companies. And that's the kind of stuff that's really exciting to me. Because what's really surprising is just how fast all this has happened. Shortly after we released GraphQL almost 2 years ago, I actually wrote down what I predicted would happen next, along with some rough dates for what I considered to be maybe a best-case scenario, and I called it my GraphQL secret master plan for world domination. Now, if you've seen my talk from GraphQL Summit last fall, this will look a little bit familiar, but I do think it's worth checking in to see the progress that we've made in just about 6 months. So for the first few months, I was excited, and my predictions were looking pretty accurate. Personal projects and hobbyists, they started to build things, and that's where the GraphQL community originally came from. And then we kind of sped down this list. I thought it would maybe take 2 years, which we're not even 2 yet, to see GraphQL implemented in 10 languages. That was my benchmark. But within under a year, there were well over a dozen. And today, almost all of those are being used in production by real companies at scale. And so speaking of real companies using GraphQL, I thought it would take, I don't know, maybe 4 years before we saw some real heavy hitter companies using GraphQL, other than Facebook, of course. And I was just like totally wrong. Here we are, less than 2 years later. And who's using GraphQL? Well, we've heard from a bunch of companies today. And of course, at Facebook, we've extended GraphQL to the rest of our family to include Instagram and Oculus. But it's also used at a ton of other well-known tech companies. We've heard from GitHub, but there's also Yelp, Airbnb, Shopify we heard from. There's Netflix, If This Then That, Zillow, Twitch, Zing, Coursera, Khan Academy, Twitter, Concur, Intuit, even IBM. This is, of course, not a total list of companies. These are just the people who responded to me within a couple hours when I posted on Twitter the other day asking. So this is just people who are paying attention. Beyond tech companies, GraphQL is also used at PlayStation, Major League Soccer and baseball, the Financial Times, The Economist, National Geographic, and the New York Times. So this is not limited to tech companies. And how about big companies? Well, Tesco's using GraphQL now. That's a big company. And if that's not big enough, how about the world's largest company, Walmart, whose labs team is now responsible for the open source, production-grade GraphQL server for Clojure. So we've seen lots of people using these things, which means we've also seen continuous improvements to the tools that we have for GraphQL. On the JavaScript client side, Apollo Client version 1.0 was released just a little over a month ago, which is stable, production-grade, community-focused, and it's a JavaScript client with bindings to a half a dozen of the most popular view rendering frameworks out there for JavaScript. And then there's Relay, which is our JavaScript client for GraphQL that we use at Facebook. We use it for powering lots of things, including Oculus, actually. And Relay version 1.0 was just released a couple days ago, which features the new Relay Modern API that I actually spoke at length about at React Europe earlier this week. And both Apollo Client and Relay characterize some of the best practices in client development that we heard a little bit about from Dan Schaefer earlier today. And this is no accident, as one of the best things that's come out of this community is our ability to share what we've learned with each other, both at big conferences like this one, but also in local meetups and many discussions online. And then there's tools for native client developers. So Apollo Client has recently released some pretty good integrations with Swift for iOS and Java for Android. But this is actually one of those areas that I would love to see a lot more diversity in the ideas and investment in open source. Because as much as I'm a proponent of the web and of React Native, I believe that a platform like GraphQL can only really succeed when there are multiple options available for every platform that we care about. And that's just not the case yet. So there's been some more recent developments, including improved developer tools for GraphQL. Of course, probably everyone in the room knows about Graphical, which is our in-browser query editor and explorer. And we released this shortly after GraphQL itself, and I kind of credit it for helping to popularize the GraphQL platform. And Graphical continues to gain features and have an improved experience. And a lot of that is actually because of community-sent pull requests, which is great. And related to GraphQL is a new project that I'm super excited about. It's called GraphQL Language Service. GraphQL Language Service integrates with your IDE to provide some of the same features that you see in Graphical for a best-in-class IDE experience with the same type ahead, auto-completion, and error handling that you get in Graphical, but in your editor. This is still a new project, and my teammate Hyo Jong is building it along with some of the members of the community. So we started with the Atom editor, which is what a lot of the developers at Facebook use, but we've already started to expand it to IntelliJ and VS Code and plan to make this pluggable so you can put it into any IDE that supports this kind of plugin. Finally, there's all the services built for GraphQL so far, and this is an area that I think is going to continue to expand. There's awesome hosted GraphQL backends like GraphQL, Scaffold, and Reindex, and tools that integrate into your existing servers to provide better visibility, like Apollo Optics that we've heard about a few times today. And just this last week, Apollo and Reindex teamed up to launch Launchpad, which if you haven't checked it out, you have to. It lets you quickly build and host GraphQL servers without ever leaving your browser. It's kind of like CodePen or JS Fiddle, but for GraphQL servers. This thing is crazy. And so all this is truly amazing, because so much of what I just talked about has been built in the last 6 months. When I talked about the same list of things at GraphQL Summit last year, this was the area that I told everyone to go focus on, and it seems like we did. So what's next on this list? Ubiquity. Now, I don't think that GraphQL has reached Ubiquity yet. There's still so much to build and so much work that needs to be done. And we'll need lots more people and companies trying out GraphQL, and most importantly, more tools and continuously better tools to provide a truly awesome developer experience. At this point, GraphQL is much bigger than just my team at Facebook, so we're really looking to all of you in the community to help make this happen, because we're not going to be the ones to build all these tools. And I do think that GraphQL can become a ubiquitous technology, especially if we look at two of the technologies that I most often hear GraphQL compared to, SQL and REST. Now, SQL and GraphQL are both structured declarative query languages for referencing related data. And they're both really great tools for slightly different problems. SQL for relational databases, and GraphQL for APIs over the web, or I guess now graph databases, as we saw earlier today. And REST and GraphQL both provide a framework for representing and transferring data across the web. They're great tools for slightly different problems. REST for serving up structured resources over HTTP, and GraphQL for allowing form-fitting requests over your own resources and services. So I'm not sure what the measure for ubiquity is, but I don't think it would be wrong to argue that both of these two technologies are ubiquitous, especially for the kinds of things that we all build day to day. The difference is that SQL is over 40 years old, and REST is almost 20. GraphQL, by comparison, has been publicly published for under 2 years. With some time and some effort and care, I really believe that we'll see GraphQL become just as ubiquitous as these two. However, to do this is going to be hard, and it's something that I've put a lot of thought into, actually. When I consider how 40 years later that SQL is still considered an excellent tool and something that we would expect anyone in our industry to know, I think it boils down to just a handful of things. First is a clean abstraction. Part of what's so amazing about SQL is that for the massive number of people who have ever used SQL, whether they've set up a database or just written a query, almost none of them have ever needed to actually peek underneath at the underlying code and data structures that make that thing work. That's almost unheard of in other abstraction layers that typically offer up escape hatches to layer below as part of their public APIs. A clean abstraction means that database engines below can be heavily optimized, and the tools above can make safe assumptions about what can and can't happen. And so my hope is that GraphQL can offer a similarly clean abstraction, hiding the details of microservices and cache layers and data migrations away from the minds of client developers. And despite SQL being one of the most commonly used tools in our field, we don't really have like SQL Conf, right? Like we're not talking about the latest features added to SQL this year. Because of course SQL's evolved over the years, and database vendors have added some pretty great improvements, but that's because they've been able to build atop a stable base. That stable base allows us to move seamlessly between vendors, platforms, and programming languages while still expecting all of our tools and services to keep working. GraphQL, by comparison, is still really young, but we're going to be folding in these improvements as we learn, and our goal should be to aim for this stable base. And finally, we can't reach ubiquity without being easy to learn. I think learnability is one of the most undervalued and misunderstood aspects of most of the tools that we build and use every day. Both REST and GraphQL, or both in REST and SQL, sorry, what they get right is a really fast time to aha moment. When you first visit a really well-made REST API, it just feels like you're surfing the web. It's awesome. Within moments, you can envision kind of what you could build with that. That's great. And similarly, it doesn't take that long to learn select star from or insert into SQL statements. And once you've got that, within a few minutes, you can build something real. Now, I don't think that GraphQL is in a bad position here. The core concepts are pretty straightforward, and there's tools like Graphical that can shorten that time to aha moment. However, learnability is still constantly on my mind when considering future changes to GraphQL, and still needs to be a consistent focus for all of us as we continue to build tools and services around this thing. So let's talk about the GraphQL specification. First, why do we actually have a specification? Most of the concepts and the tools and the software that we use every day, they don't have this. So why does GraphQL need one? Well, first, it allows implementations across many different programming languages. Starting with one official library and porting it over to other languages, that can often leave some details lost in translation, and different environments that have different behaviors can result in some skew between how these things work. Instead, having a common spec allows us to describe the behavior that we always expect, and I credit this for one of the reasons why we were able to see a dozen different implementations of GraphQL in different languages within under a year of releasing it. And the spec lets us not only have different implementations of GraphQL on the server side, but it also lets us communicate with them with clients written for different languages and different platforms, all built by different people. Any given server and any given client can agree on how to interoperate because they can rely on behaviors well-defined in the spec. And the real value that we get from this spec is this formation and creation of a stable base. However, we also want to be able to expand when necessary to enable some new use cases. So we favor points of extension to allow for experimentation. So my teammate Dan talked earlier about how we added directives to GraphQL to enable exactly this kind of thing. And we've seen directives featured in a number of presentations today for their ability to imbue custom or experimental behavior, which is kind of good validation that maybe this was the right decision to put this in here. But the directives alone are probably not going to be enough to cover all possible future use cases. So what we really need is a philosophy that will help us kind of guide a balance between our desire to create the stable base, but also the need to address new upcoming use cases that are real. So as the GraphQL specification continues to evolve, what we really want to do is do that with a couple things in mind. First is that we always want to ensure backwards compatibility. So a really important feature of GraphQL is that once a query is written, it should always mean the same thing and get back the same kind of result. And this is super important for us at Facebook because when we launch iOS or Android apps, there are no guarantees that people will ever upgrade to a new version. And I heard some people on stage talking about once we deprecate a field in 6 months we'll kill it. And I laughed because we still have people using that first version 5.0 that Dan was talking about, the first version of our iOS app that uses GraphQL. That's still used in production. And we still support those queries and they still work 5 years later. So what that means is that as we make changes to GraphQL and as it evolves, we want to make sure any of those things we're doing it in a careful way so as not to change the meaning or behavior of any of these existing queries. Also, we consider performance a feature, and this is because GraphQL comes from an environment where we're building real products. GraphQL does not and will not provide the ability to write queries with unexpectedly terrible performance against a server developer's will. Of course, a server developer could always make a slow schema, but we want to make it as hard as possible for people to accidentally do something slow. So a good example of this in another framework is ordering by an unindexed field in SQL. Of course, you might not realize what you've done until it's too late, and the DBA comes running to your desk and you're like, what have you done? You have to change it. How could you ship this? We don't want to do that. We want to have the flexibility for developers to write any kind of query and avoid this double-edged sword of potential pitfalls. So I think SQL is great for this ad hoc exploration of data, but because it lets you shoot yourself in the foot in a couple of ways, we've been very careful about the performance characteristics of how queries in production will work. And since GraphQL is designed for web APIs, we want to ensure that our server developers can only expose what's possible to execute quickly, and hopefully our DBAs will thank us for that. Next, we want to favor no change, which sounds a little counterintuitive when we're talking about how to evolve things. But this is so that we can trend towards a stable base. We need to bias ourselves towards not making changes, and instead set a really high bar for new features added to GraphQL. So when we do this, we actually have a set of questions that we ask ourselves for every new proposed addition. First, it's, are we solving a real problem? Is this just like a cool idea, or is there a real product problem that's motivating this suggestion? Also, does adding this actually enable new use cases? Or is it just like syntax sugar over something else that already exists? And for those new use cases, just how common are they? And could we do this in a way where we can enable it without changing GraphQL? And if we can, kind of keep things as they are, but maybe it's a little awkward, just how awkward will it be? Because it's way more important to be able to solve problems at all than to solve all problems beautifully. And I'd rather have GraphQL be as simple as possible and be awkward in some edge cases than let GraphQL become unlearnably complicated. So adding to the spec is not the first step for a new idea. We prove it first. After answering all of those questions, the next step should be to go build and use that proposed new feature yourself. And this helps go a step beyond thinking about an idea on paper so that you can actually learn and practice what works and what can be improved before leading the rest of the community to the same fate. This aligns really closely to what my teammate Dan was talking about with client-driven development, where everything that we've added to the spec so far, we first proved in production. We did that in a way that can be really tricky to get right by doing things on the client first, and once we'd proven that they worked, then expanded them to the server. And I think that's going to be even more important as we continue to do this work in the open source community. Because while I think it's really important that we continue to communicate and we share progress on early work, it's also really important not to end up being overly reliant on an experimental feature that could totally change or go away. And finally, what we want to do is set a fairly slow and steady pace. Because really, a specification is more of a social document than it is a technical one. And the real value that we get from the spec is this community that we've built around it. And what we want to do is ensure that teams aren't constantly racing to keep up with changes to avoid a situation where every GraphQL library ends up implementing a slightly different set of the features. So our plan is to release new versions of the GraphQL spec twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. We've actually been able to do that roughly well so far, and we're going to, hopefully as time goes on, make that a little bit more formal. So it's really important for us to communicate broadly about the potential changes that we're going to make before we actually make them. That way we have an opportunity for folks in the community to both provide some feedback and to plan ahead. So if we're going to talk about communicating spec changes, well, after months of work, we're getting pretty close to releasing the next version of the GraphQL spec, and it's going to bring some of the biggest changes to GraphQL since its public release almost 2 years ago. So there's 4 new important additions that are coming in this next release. There's a handful of new validation rules. There are error key paths, which is really great for answering some of those questions about handling errors. There's the schema definition language, and there's GraphQL subscriptions. So today I want to focus on 2 of these, the schema language and subscriptions. Both of these have actually been in operation at Facebook for years now, and both have evolved a lot with feedback and collaboration, both from our teams at Facebook and in the whole GraphQL community. So first, the schema definition language. Sometimes we refer to this as the schema, or the GraphQL IDL. IDL stands for Interface Definition Language, which is kind of a term of art, but the true name for this thing is the schema definition language. So I'm often surprised when I talk to people about this, and they learn that the schema language is actually an experimental feature. This is not an official part of GraphQL yet, but there's already tons of awesome tools that are built on top of this and are taking advantage of it. So I'm super excited that this is going to be one of the next things that's coming in. So the schema definition language started as an informal shorthand for us to talk about parts of the GraphQL schema, and we actually use it in the spec when sharing examples as kind of an informal way to talk about things. So what it really does is it offers the ability for us to describe GraphQL types in a way that's easy to read, but also, more importantly, machine readable, so that we can use it for powerful tools. Today, we often use it at Facebook as a file format when saving our schema after introspection. And it's also used in the community with tools like GraphQL and Apollo tools. That way you can actually build your schema from this in the first place, which is pretty cool. So since then, we started using it as a shorthand, and we've been working on this to fill in some edge cases, make sure that we had ways to represent descriptions and field deprecations, and had a handful of other improvements. There's still a handful of details that we're still hammering out, but this is coming really soon. But I think what most people are excited about is the addition of subscriptions to the GraphQL spec, adding the ability to use GraphQL atop real-time systems. So GraphQL Subscriptions was actually originally built 3 years ago as an experiment at Facebook to see if we could use GraphQL to power the likes and comments on Facebook newsfeed stories. And since then, it's actually been expanded to cover dozens of different live features on Facebook, including the new live video feature that launched earlier this year. But this is an experiment, right? Even though it's 3 years old, we kind of keep changing this thing. It's definitely experimental. And shortly after releasing GraphQL, there's this question of how do we address real-time data? And that became one of the most constantly asked questions by the community. So we started to tell people about this experiment that we had. And last year at React Europe, this was actually a major part of our talking about some of the experiments that we were doing at Facebook with GraphQL. And that excited others in the community, especially the Apollo team. So they built Apollo Subscriptions. They had a lot of experience with this stuff, especially since they worked on Meteor before. But of course, that too is experimental. So starting around the beginning of this year, those experiments led to a formal proposal to the GraphQL specification that was co-led by my teammate Rob Zhu, who's here today, and his collaborator from Apollo, Yuri Goldstein. And in the last week, actually, the bulk of these have been merged, both into the spec and into the reference implementation, GraphQL.js. And very soon, these are going to be released as fully supported. So, pretty cool, pretty cool. So just super briefly, to go into this a little bit more deeply, we actually have Yuri here today, who's going to just give you a really quick look at what GraphQL Subscriptions looks like. Yuri?
Thanks, Lee. And thank you for bringing us on to this amazing journey to actually take your ideas that were super inspiring for us and then making it bringing it to the community with the community. At Apollo, we were basically focused on we see our goal as taking the amazing stuff that are in the GraphQL spec or even are experimental in the GraphQL spec and bringing you the tools that you can use that today, and also validating those ahead of time so we can help and bring our feedback to Lee and the team. So today, like Lee announced, you can use GraphQL Subscriptions. It's merged into the spec and merged into the reference implementation. And that means that everyone now can start just using GraphQL Subscription and bringing real time into your apps. And that's supposed to be super easy, right? We can just, clients can subscribe to certain selection sets, and then every time there's an event happen, those events will push into real time into your clients. Sounds super easy, but during that process that we introduced into the community, we got a lot of feedback from the community, and we saw that it's not that simple. There's a lot of things to consider. One thing is that now and I'm not going to cover everything, I have very little time, but one thing is that now our apps are becoming stateful. And this is a very hard problem to solve. Another thing is that now the transport actually is bidirectional. Now, the clients, we actually need to push data from the servers to the clients, which is a completely new thing for us. Now, there's many problems that you get introduced while doing that, and there's also a lot of existing solutions for similar problems out there. And those are definitely multiple when you're going to scale. If you want now if you're going in production, you need to scale your apps, and you need to manage all those clients subscribing to different selection sets, and there's a lot to think about. Well, the amazing thing about the process that Lee was talking about is that during that time, we were able to build from the amazing future of GraphQL talk that Lee mentioned a year ago till today. We were able, with the community, to build the tools that you can use today in order to introduce GraphQL Subscriptions into your apps in production. I'm going to cover very briefly 4 types of those solutions that you probably would use when you use GraphQL. One thing is to handle all the stream of events, and most of you probably use Redis or MQTT or all kinds of queue systems. Then we build NPM packages in order for you to integrate with those integrate those events into your GraphQL server. If you're using JavaScript, then you'll be very happy to hear that GraphQL.js now supports subscriptions, evaluating and validating them. But probably if you use that, you also need extra tools like filtering the results and maybe handling and mapping channels. So GraphQL Subscriptions NPM packages will actually give you that. But also if you're not using JavaScript or Node on the server, Sangria was also a spearhead with us and introduced GraphQL Subscription very early on. So you can probably use that. And the same thing goes for the GraphQL as a backend services like GraphQL and Scaffold that worked with us and actually used the same transport as we use in order to send publication to your clients. And the last part of those libraries that you can use and need to use today is the transport. So we introduced GraphQL WebSocket Transport, which you can use, actually send your subscriptions, but also queries and mutations over WebSocket, and you can use it today. And then the last part is handling those changes when it gets to your client, which is where Relay and Apollo client for JavaScript, iOS, or Android can just help you to determine what to do with the changes that are pushed into your app, and you can integrate into your apps today. So it was an amazing process, and we built all those tools with the help of everyone in the community. So thanks, Lee, and thanks for the community to bringing us here. And yeah, start using it today. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuri. So the proposal for GraphQL Subscriptions embodies a lot of what we've been talking about today for how we'll see GraphQL evolve. It started with experiments that were used to build real features. In fact, at Facebook, we first built this entirely client-side, another example of Dan's client-driven design. And at the time, this led subscriptions through significant early changes, and we were able to iterate quickly towards something that we felt good about. Then an RFC, or request for comments, was written by Rob Zhu, which focused mostly on describing the problems of real-time systems, made a case for why subscriptions deserve to be added to the spec, and then described a few possible solutions, including the one that we were using at Facebook. And this actually did bring in a ton of comments, so we got a request. In the following couple months, both Rob, Yuri, and others in the community went in depth with each open question and helped to establish not just what GraphQL subscriptions would include, but also what it would not and why. Details and edge cases were hashed out with intense discussion. Finally, Rob's been painstakingly working and editing a pull request that adds all the spec language, while Yuri's been building an awesome reference implementation in a pull request to GraphQL.js. So all of this means that while we're adding a major new piece to the GraphQL family, you can trust that it's being used in production at great scale and that it's contributing towards GraphQL's stable base. And I'm excited to announce one more step that we're taking really soon to ensure that the evolution of the spec continues in the way that I've been describing. As part of a collaboration between Facebook and Apollo, we're starting what's called the GraphQL Working Group. And this is going to be a set of roughly monthly open invitation meetings that are going to focus on the discussion around the evolving GraphQL specification. And our goal is not for these meetings to become widely attended, but instead to be super focused, and we're going to be sharing notes covering what we've talked about. So stay tuned as we work out the details of this and start scheduling the first of the GraphQL Working Group meetings. So in just a short time, GraphQL has gone from a tool that we use at Facebook to an important part of the developer community. Today has been clear proof of that. Watching it grow, for me, has been deeply exciting and fulfilling, and I can't wait to see what we all build together next. So thank you all for having me, and thanks all for being here.